Hello. Today I will discuss about credit risk. So, the fundamentals of credit risk, what is it, and how is it important in financial industry. So, in these days, financial industry jobs become more lucrative, and there are different kinds of jobs available in financial industry. One maybe investment banking, one maybe trader, and some people may go to risk management. So credit risk comes under risk management. So there are three clear classifications of risk management. One is credit risk, one is market risk, and one is model validation. So credit risk, the people who work in credit risk, they actually calculate exposure for different kinds of trade, and they calculate the credit risk of different trades. So what is credit risk? Credit risk is if the counterparty defaults, how much money that we will lose. So suppose I am in a trade with you, and suppose you default, and that means you just don't want to pay the money, then how much money I will lose. So that's credit risk. So that so one calculation for credit risk is exposure. So you can find the exposure of a trade, that how much you are exposed to the counterparty. So when the counterparty defaults, how much you will lose, and that exposure helps to calculate RWA, that is risk weighted asset. So risk weighted asset is something that banks need to keep with them, and that risk weighted asset, there are three major things that actually drive risk weighted asset. One is PD, that is probability of default, one is LGD, loss given default, and one is EAD, that is exposure at default. So you can understand that suppose how much you will lose, that is exposure at default. That suppose you will default right now, then how much you will lose, that is exposure. And now the question comes that okay, if you default, I will lose this amount of money, but what is the probability that you will default? So it is not always true that every time you will default. So say there is 1/100 probability that you will default, so that is probability of default. And the third things come is loss given default. So it's not always true that if you default right now, then I won't get any kind of money. So suppose I actually assured some kind of money from you before we go into the trade, maybe some collateral is there, or some other types of asset that I already have kept. Or suppose if you default right now, if you declare yourself to be bankrupt, I may recover your asset right now. So that's so the loss given default, it is not always 100%. So every time it is not true that if you default, that I am going to lose 100% of the exposure that we have against you. But yes, there is certain amount of exposure that will still remain after the calculation of loss given default. So these three things actually helps to calculate RWA, which is called risk weighted asset. So banks need to declare that they how much they have risk weighted asset, that is how much asset uh, or how risky their trades are, and that's actually Basel norm. So and that Basel defines what how much money that you should keep based on your PD, LGD, and EAD. So that's different thing, that is a huge calculation. But so I was talking about credit risk, and there is something called market risk, so which is the opposite of that thing. So suppose if the counterparty does not default, but if you end up with losing money in a trade. So suppose you and me started playing a game, and suppose if you win, then I am going to lose. So that's market risk. So if how much I am uh, I may lose if you win the trade, that's all. So if the counterparty defaults, that is actually in that scenario profitable for me. If you default in any time period and you were in a winning situation, then probably it is profitable for me because I don't need to pay the money to you. But if you default at any point in time, and you were in a winning situation, then it is loss for you but gain for me. But if you are in a uh, suppose you, if I am in a winning situation and you are my counterparty, and if you default, then uh, because as you default I may not win that money, ultimately I may not recover that money from you, so that I will definitely lose. That is credit risk. And market risk is how much I may lose if I lost in the trade. That's market risk. And there is a third portion of the risk management, that is model validation, who actually do the validation task for the credit and market risk models. So when you make models for credit and market risk, someone needs to there which should be independent body for credit and market risk, who actually validate that model, how that model works and how much significant that models are. So you cannot say certainly that what, because everything is in future, so it is not going to default today, or the exposure that you are calculating, that is not going to be the exposure today may not be because the today's exposure is your mark to market, but you need to calculate exposure tomorrow and maybe in future. So that um, who should say that the exposure that you have calculated is perfect or not? So there should be some team who actually who actually validate this kind of models. So that is model validations. And so these three portions of risk management normally exist in companies. So that is many people say that financial risk management. So suppose if you go under risk management, there is credit risk, market risk, and model validation. And credit risk model, so there are different teams which calculates probability of default, which calculates loss given default, and which calculate exposure at default. So the most difficult parts come into the picture where exposure at default. So how much you are exposed to default. So if the counterparty defaults, how much you are exposed in the market, so how much money that you will going to lose. So probability of default, it is just a probability, you can understand, but it is also you need to calculate, but that's normally based on some rating that the counterparty has. So if the counterparty has very good rating, then you may have very low probability of default, but if the counterparty has a very high rating, then you have very low probability of default for the counterparty. If the counterparty has very low rating, that counterparty has very high probability of default. So that's probability of default. And loss given default is just how much money that you can recover from the counterparty if the counterparty defaults. And the exposure at default, that is calculated based on something called uh, EAD, and that is calculated from EEP, that is effective expected positive exposure. So that's the computation is quite complicated. So what people normally do, people normally simulate the exposure of different kinds of trade. So how can you calculate the exposure, because you don't know what is the scenario for tomorrow. So people normally use Monte Carlo simulation. So Monte Carlo simulation is a technique where people use random numbers to see the scenarios, possible future scenarios. So suppose today I have 1 rupee note, then what would be its value tomorrow? So that you don't know, it may be 1.01 rupee, it may be 0.999 rupees. So that you need to simulate. So people actually assume some distribution regarding some market scenario or some past experiences, or something called back testing, and different kinds of ways to find the distribution that uh, the asset follows. Suppose for the stocks, it is very usual to follow usual to take some distribution which does not take negative value. So for stock, it is not very usual that you take for stock it follows normal distribution, because normal distribution can take value negative, but stocks does not take negative values. So it's better to assume something log normal distribution, which is geometric Brownian motion. But suppose for interest rate, the same concepts were there. People used this log normal distributions for interest rate, but right now these days interest rate, people have an idea that interest rate can go negative, and in certain currencies like CHF and the Swiss franc and Japanese yen, interest rate actually went negative. So it is better to use something normal distribution. But how much normality you want, that is a point, because you cannot want an interest rate to be negative infinity. That is not also possible, because interest rate cannot be again minus 5% also, but there is a good probability that interest rate can go minus 5% if you assume it follows normal distribution. So there are many trade-offs, what distribution you need to take, and how you actually use that distribution. But people normally use Monte Carlo simulation to find the exposure of different kinds of trade. So in future, what would be the value of a trade? Suppose so there are uh, many different kinds of trades available in this world right now. So suppose uh, many classifications, you can classify some exotic trades, some structured trades, and some basic trades like interest rate swaps, equities, credit products, and there are many exotic trades available in this world right now. So the basics is, suppose if there is uh, any agreement between you and me, then if tomorrow you default, then how much money I will lose. So that's actually finding what would be my profit, what would be my mark to market tomorrow. So that mark to market is a concept which says that how much you are in a gain situation from the market, not in value but from the market. So suppose it's not actually because in market is not always same every day. So today 1 rupee value may not be tomorrow's 1 rupee value, that need not be same. Tomorrow the value of 1 rupee may change. So that's why according to market, how much you are in a profitable or non-profitable situation tomorrow. So that's basically exposure calculation. So exposure calculation, uh, people normally simulate exposure for different kinds of trade, and that simulations, people normally find that the 95th percentile, they call it PE. So suppose if I simulate tomorrow's exposure, suppose I simulate 10,000 values for tomorrow's exposure, then suppose if I calculate 95th percentile of that value, then that I will call PE, that is potential exposure. And so it actually is an indication that how much maximum I am going to lose tomorrow, because 95th percentile is a pretty good estimate for the maximum, because we cannot take that exactly how much I will lose tomorrow. Then we should take 100 percentile, but 100 percentile will be too large value. So suppose if you take normal distribution, and then 100 percentile may be a huge, it may be infinity, so tomorrow you can lose infinity. So that's not also a feasible situation. So you can take 95th percentile, some people take 90th percentile, it based on some regulators. And the second thing is exposure, effective exposure. So where people actually take the positive simulated values. So suppose you have 10,000 simulation, and out of that suppose 7,000 simulations give positive values and 3,000 simulations give negative values. So for the negative values, you actually don't need to bother, because if you lose tomorrow, it is not subjected to credit risk, it is actually subjected to market risk. So if you lose tomorrow, then you are not going to lose any money, actually you are gaining money, because tomorrow you will be in a position where you are in loss, and the counterparty defaults, you don't need to pay that money. So you are in a gain situation if the counterparty defaults. So you don't need to bother about this thing. You need to bother about the thing when the counterparty defaults and you will lose money. So that's the positive side of that exposure. So for the positive side of the exposure, if you take all the positive simulated values and you take the average of that, that is expected exposure. And that that the if you take different time buckets, so time buckets are something that are normally defined by Basel. So Basel norms exist in the market, and that normally all the banks right now follows Basel norms, and that they actually specify that in which time bucket you need to find the exposure. So it is not also a good idea to find exposure today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and suppose the trade is for 3 years, then or the 30 years, then you need to calculate exposure for 30 years every day. It is not a feasible situation. So you need to find exposure at different points, and that different points are specified some other body, and they define that suppose 1 day exposure you need, 2 day exposure you need, or 1 week exposure you need, or maybe 1 year exposure you need. How in which day you exactly need the exposure. You don't need to find the exposure in every day. That is computationally very difficult. So you need to find that exposure. So when you find that exposure at, suppose if you plot the E for different time buckets, you will get a curve, and that curve, if you make it the curve non-decreasing in nature, that curve becomes EPE curves, that is effective expected positive exposure. So if you take different time buckets in x-axis and y-axis, if you plot E, that is expected exposure at different point in time, then that curve that you see, that is actually E curve. And if you make it non-decreasing, so suppose the curve actually increase somewhere and then it starts decreasing. So when it starts decreasing, you can make it just constant. So then that curves become EPE curves, that is effective expected positive exposure, and that's actually used to calculate and if you take that average of that, that is actually become EPE. If you take average of that curve, means the area under the curve, then that becomes EPE, effective expected positive exposure, and that is used for RW calculation. So it's not so easy what I explained right now, but yes, there are many techniques to calculate exposure, and that depends upon the nature of the underlying. So underlying is something, suppose interest rate is an underlying, stock is an underlying for option, interest rate is an underlying for interest rate swap or cap flows. So suppose interest rate follows some distribution, normal distribution. By assuming that, we can generate some random numbers, and that random numbers helps us to find the tomorrow's interest rate value, and that tomorrow's interest rate value helps us to find tomorrow's interest rate swap value, and that is tomorrow's uh, MTM, or tomorrow's profit from that interest rate swap. And if the counterparty defaults tomorrow, then how much money I am going to lose, that is actually the value of the interest rate swap going to be tomorrow. That's how people calculate interest rate swaps, or for any kind of trends in general, what is its value and what is its future value, and how uh, e- how the exposure changes with time. At different times it is different, and sometimes it is just increasing, sometimes it is decreasing after increase to some point. This is how EAD is calculated, and this is overall the basics of credit risk. And people uh, use some techniques to find the collateral management in credit risk. So collateral management, it is it is different from exposure calculation. So suppose if you and I went to on an agreement, then suppose if you default, I will lose some money, that's true. But the thing, suppose I know that there is a possibility that he will default, so I may ask for some collateral before going into that agreement. So suppose if you pay me, suppose some rupees, x rupees right now, and you may default tomorrow, then I know that if you default, then I will at least recover that x rupees. I may not recover the value of the trade from you, but I will at least recover that x rupees. So that's why that collateral helps to mitigate the effect of credit risk. People sometimes calculates that how much collateral they should take, and there is huge bunch of calculation used to find what is the collateral, how much collateral you should take, and in which way you should take, because sometimes it is taken in bond, sometimes it is taken in foreign currency, sometimes it is taken in the most safest treasury bond, and different products. It's not something that you need to take collateral as a bond. You can take equity as a collateral, or anything can be taken as collateral which has some value. So that is the basics of credit risk. Thank you friends, thanks for watching.